Hello everybody, I'm Dr. Will Baker from the Centre for Global Englishes at the University of Southampton. And I'd like to thank Professor Wenley and her colleagues for inviting me to talk to you about global Englishes and intercultural and transcultural communication and its relevance for teaching through and about Englishes. So I'm going to give 3 presentations. In the first presentation here, I'm going to talk about what global Englishes and intercultural and transcultural communication are and why they're important. And then in the following 2 presentations, we're going to explore the implications of that for teaching and learning through English. So in this presentation, we're going to look at how English is used on a global scale for communication across and beyond cultures and nations. So specifically, we're going to look at global Englishes and intercultural communication. And within that, we're going to look at English as a lingua franca and approaches to understanding intercultural communication and the differences between earlier cross-cultural approaches. We're also going to look at the most recent theories of transcultural communication, and finally we will look at key implications for teaching. And this is what we'll expand on in the following 2 presentations. So firstly, global Englishes and intercultural communication. Why is this important? Well, as you can see from the diagram here, English is estimated to be learned by and spoken by at least 1.5 billion learners as a foreign language. So this is non-native speakers of the language. And as you can see, compared to the circles for other languages, this is hugely more learned and spoken than any other language in the world. So this means that English is the most commonly used lingua franca for intercultural communication. So it's very likely that many of you regularly use English to communicate with other people from other cultures. So learning through English, whether it be EMI or CLIL, or whether you're using English for business or tourism, etc., you're most likely to be using English for intercultural communication, and the kind of English you're most likely to be using is English as a lingua franca. And an important thing to take away from this is that the majority of people who use English are non-native speakers of the language. And this has major implications for how we understand how we need to use English and how we teach through English. So to explain some of the terminology I'm going to be using, we'll begin with English. So global Englishes has been defined as the linguistic and social cultural dimensions of global uses and users of English. So that's the definition we use at the Centre for Global Englishes. To go into a bit more detail, we see it as an umbrella term that covers English as a lingua franca research, English as an international language research, and world Englishes research. And today we're going to focus on English as a lingua franca, as this is the most common use of English and the most relevant one, I think, for you. So Barber-Seidelhofer defines English as a lingua franca as any use of English among speakers of different first languages for whom English is the communicative medium of choice and often only option. So the key point here is that English as a lingua franca refers to a use of English. It's not a particular variety of English, but rather it's a variable way of using English for communication between people who don't share a first language. More recently, Jennifer Jenkins has defined English as a lingua franca, or rather she's defined it as English as a multilingua franca. So here, multilingual communication in which English is available as a contact language of choice but is not necessarily chosen. So the key point here is the emphasis on multilingualism. So English as a lingua franca is seen as part of multilingual communication. And remember that the majority of English as a lingua franca users are non-native speakers of the language, so they will have another language, so English is used in that sense in a multilingual setting. Also, the majority of English as a lingua franca or global English's use is in settings which are not Anglophone settings, so again there will be local languages. So multilingualism is a big part of English as a lingua franca, or rather English as a lingua franca should be seen as part of wider multilingual practices. Okay, now turning to intercultural communication. Intercultural communication can be defined as communication where cultural and linguistic differences are perceived as relevant to the interaction by participants and or researchers. So communication where cultural or language differences affect the communication in one way or another. So to explain that in a little more detail, we can make a distinction between cross-cultural communication and intercultural communication. And it will obviously be intercultural communication that we're going to focus on. So I think cross-cultural communication can be problematic. Yeah, this is problematic because it's too simplistic, I think it's essentialist and it's stereotyped. But it is perhaps the most common approach or understanding of what I would call intercultural communication. So if you look at the column on the left, you have cross-cultural communication practices here. So for example, the practices of Chinese people. Yeah, how do they greet each other? How do they say goodbye? Maybe how do they do things like communicate about eating? How do they communicate apologies, compliments, things like that? Yeah, and the idea is that if you build up a description of those communicative practices and then you compare them with another group, so let's say, I don't know, French communicative practices, you can compare what's similar and different and predict how intercultural communication or cross-cultural communication will proceed. Yeah, but I think this is very problematic because in intercultural communication, people typically know they're communicating with someone who has a different language and culture to them, and they adapt their communication according to that. So you can't really predict exactly what's going to happen, and you certainly can't predict it based on what people do in their first language and in their first culture. So in intercultural communication, we focus on actual cases of interaction. So intercultural communication is typically based on research where people have gathered data of people interacting across cultural and linguistic differences. So in intercultural communication, unlike cross-cultural communication, cultures are seen as dynamic and blurred. Yep, so there isn't a clear line between one culture and another. So for example, there isn't a clear line between Italian and British culture. Yet there are many overlaps between them, there are blurs between them. People adapt bits of each culture. Cultures are also seen as heterogeneous, so they're not the same. People within a cultural grouping will differ quite a lot. So I'm sure you're all familiar with people who have different ways of communicating within your first language culture. Furthermore, culture is not looked at just at the national level. So national cultures are of course important, our nations are an important part of our identity, but they're not our only part. We have many different communities or groupings that we orientate towards. So this could include local cultures, could also include global cultures, but also things like our gender, our age, our sexuality, our profession, our family, our leisure group, etc. So in intercultural communication, we try not to make a priori assumptions about how people will communicate. Rather, we look at what happens in the communication and we expect variety, diversity and adaptability. And also, importantly, participants can be seen as in-between cultures, so where they're not part of any particular culture. And this is very different to earlier cross-cultural communication research where people are seen as fixed into particular national cultures. So, combining global Englishes and intercultural communication research, we can say that global Englishes and ELF, like all communication, is not culturally neutral. So I think that's an important point because sometimes people think that communicating through English as a global language doesn't have any cultural content. However, that's not possible. All communication has participants, it has context, it has purposes and it has meaning. And all of this comes about through culture. So culture is always there in communication. However, what's interesting about global Englishes, and different perhaps, is that the cultural references are not fixed. So the use of English does not have to be linked to any specific national culture. So English as a lingua franca is not linked necessarily to the UK or the US or any other Anglophone culture. It can be linked to the particular cultures of the participants or the settings that they're in, or even something more fluid, as we'll see later on. And we should also point out, or I should also point out, that this is not unique to global Englishes. It's something that probably happens in most multilingual and multicultural settings, but it's just perhaps easier to see through English as used as a global language because it is so prevalent. So what kinds of identities, cultures and communities do we typically see through global Englishes? So I've listed a selection of research studies here which highlight, I think, some of the key things that we see. So first of all, people often move between their local L1 identities and more global orientations. Secondly, people can share their multilingual and multicultural identities. So typically people know they're in an intercultural situation, and what's shared is that they have different multilingual resources and that they have multicultural resources as well. People may also identify with very dynamic communities of practice and virtual communities. So these are the kinds of groupings that we get through things such as professions. So maybe a group of teachers from different language and cultural backgrounds who come together for a particular purpose. We can also see third place identities. So these are where people adopt an identity or a culture that's in between particular national cultures. So it's not part of either one or the other. Yeah, it's not part of people's first language and culture, but it's also not part of a target language and culture. It's something more adapted and hybrid. And then lastly, we see freer, liminal and fluid identities and cultural practices that can't be linked to any one particular culture or any named culture. Yeah, and we'll look at examples of both of these in a minute. So, having discussed some of the terminology and theory, I think it would be helpful to look at an example now. So this example is called Bangkok Cosplay. It's a real example recorded in a cafe in Bangkok, and it's between Philippe, who's a French speaker from Belgium, and Nami, whose first language is Thai and from Thailand. However, as you can see here, it's a very typical kind of elf interaction in that they're both using English as the contact language to communicate with each other. So I'd like you to spend a minute or two just quickly reading through that, and then we can talk about it. Okay, so now you've read through that, what I find really interesting here is the cultural content of this conversation. So as you've probably worked out, they're discussing a cosplay or a costume play. For anyone who's not familiar with that, the little illustration at the side of the dialogue shows what it is. So costume play is where people dress up as their favourite Japanese anime or manga character or Japanese pop star. This as a cultural practice began in Japan, but it spread very quickly around Asia, as this example shows, and now is a global phenomenon. So people don't just dress up as Japanese anime and manga characters, they dress up as cartoon characters from around the world, they dress up as pop stars from around the world. Yep, so the two people here, Philippe and Nami, are discussing a cultural practice that exists at many different levels. So it originates in Japan as the nation, but then moved to a kind of regional setting in terms of Asia, but has now become a global phenomenon as well. And also I think what you see here in the discussion is references to very local cultural practices as well. So in line 2, Nami says, outside of MBK it's a cosplay, right? So MBK is a shopping mall in the centre of Bangkok, and there are spaces outside there where lots of youth and teenagers often gather at the weekends and in the evenings to do various things, and I guess cosplay being one of them. So to understand that particular part, I think you'd need to have some local knowledge as well, and there are clearly local cultural references there. So what you can see here is English being used to refer to many different cultural scales, national ones, global ones, and local ones as well. And I think most importantly and most interestingly, none of these cultural references are related to Anglophone cultures in any way. So there's no reference to the UK or the US or Australia here. Yeah, and they're of no relevance to this conversation. So we see English used and we see a lot of cultural content, but that cultural content is very different to that perhaps you're more traditionally associated with, to do with national cultures and a first language and culture. So in sum, we can say that intercultural communication and ELF leads us to question assumptions about the links between languages and cultures. Yet they're seen as very fluid and emergent, and cultures and languages are not necessarily linked on a national scale. So the English language does not have to be linked to the UK or the US, yet the English language can be used to both represent and construct cultural references and practices and identities that are linked to any cultures that the participants choose. So this superdiversity and complexities of languages and cultures highlights the difficulty and inappropriateness of attempting to set culture and language current connections. So in the Bangkok cosplay example, whose cultural practices are they? Where are they located, if anywhere? And I think we can argue that this even problematises the intercultural communication, since it's not always clear what cultures participants are in between. So this leads us to the most current theory, which is transcultural communication. Now, I don't want to discuss this in too much detail, but I think it would be helpful to at least give you an overview of it. So transcultural communication can be defined as communication where interactants move through and across rather than in between cultural and linguistic boundaries. Thus, named languages and cultures can no longer be taken for granted, and in the process, borders become blurred, transgressed, and transcended. Yep, so the important thing to take away from this is that we can have culture through global Englishes, but that culture becomes so fluid and dynamic and adaptable that it's not easy or even perhaps appropriate to try and associate it to any particular culture. So if we remember the table we had with cross-cultural and intercultural, I think we can now add the transcultural to that. Now again, I'm not going to read through this in detail, but I think the things to highlight are that cultures don't necessarily have to be linked to any particular group, that any boundaries between particular cultures can be transcended and transgressed, that cultures are heterogeneous and they're contestable, so we can debate what a culture is, and that people can move through many different scales, from the local to the global to the national, but they don't have to be part of any particular one. And importantly, participants also don't have to be in between any named cultures. Yet they can be part of multiple cultural practices and cultural groupings all at the same time. So again, I think an example might help to illustrate some of this. So in this example, again, which is a real life example, this one comes from Facebook. So this is an exchange between two international students in the UK. Ken, who has Thai as his first language, and Hassam, who has Farsi as his first language and an Iranian background. And again, they use English as a lingua franca to communicate with each other. They both know each other quite well, and Ken has started this, I don't quite know what you call it, but Ken has started this practice where he likes to post things on Hassam's wall, teasing him about Bruce Lee and Jet Li. So Hassam really likes Jet Li and really dislikes Bruce Lee. So here Ken has posted a photo of Jet Li, and then he's put it next to a quotation from Bruce Lee, but very deliberately crossed out the Bruce and written Jet next to it. Yeah, and he's doing this to tease Hassam and to see what response he gets from him. Yeah, and as we can see here, he gets a very long response from Hassam, and the teasing works. So what I'd like you to do now is spend a minute or two reading through the exchange here and thinking about what are the cultural references and identities that are in this exchange, and also what are the languages used. Okay, so hopefully you've had time to read through that. As you can see here, the majority of the exchange is through English, but I would argue it's a very multilingual use of English as a lingua franca. So in line 4 we have the discussion of how you spell Li, so Li L-I, Li double-E. So this is really referring to Cantonese and Putonghua. Also we have on line 9 Cannon Feast Punch, which I guess is a translation of a Chinese martial arts term. I'm also guessing it's supposed to be Cannon Fist, not Cannon Feast Punch. But also if you look at the English is very, it's certainly not native-like. So on line 2, I'm gone kill you rather than gonna kill you or going to kill you. Yeah, but it causes no problems. It's understood perfectly by Ken and it's not corrected by anybody. So I think we have very much English used as a multilingua franca here. And in terms of the cultural content, I think this is very transcultural. So whilst we can link it to particular name cultures, it also transcends them at the same time. So you have the subject, which is martial arts, which originates in China but is now very global and I think not associated with any one particular culture, even though most people recognise its origins are Chinese. We also have the two people being discussed, the martial arts stars, Jet Li and Bruce Lee, who again have Chinese origins, although one in Hong Kong, one in mainland China, but also both became Hollywood stars and then went on to be globally recognised movie stars. Yeah, and then on top of this, we also have the identities that the participants adopt. So Hassam, who his first language is Farsi and comes from an Iranian background, orientates or identifies as the expert in martial arts here. So he knows how to spell the correct spelling of Li. He knows about Jet Li's achievements. Yeah, on lines 6 to 9, he gives lots of information about Jet Li, and also he shows some expertise in martial arts, talking about cannon fist punches. So Hassam here takes on the martial arts expertise, yeah, which you might not have predicted or expected based on a kind of first language and first culture correlation. So I think what this example shows is English used as a lingua franca, but embedded in a much kind of wider multilingual context. And I think you see multiple cultural references here with no one fixed cultural reference. So we have local, national, global, and also cultures such as martial arts, which are not fixed to any one particular place, and then participants such as Hassam orientating towards cultural identities that would not perhaps be possible without being able to transcend borders. Okay. So that's outlined some of the features of global Englishes and intercultural and transcultural communication. So what I'd like to do now is quickly summarise the key points from that, and then start to talk about what some of the implications are for learning and teaching through English. So first of all, global Englishes and ELF research shows us a diversity of English uses, users, settings and purposes. So we're talking about a very variable use of English here. And we're also talking about intercultural communication. Yep, so global Englishes are used for intercultural communication. But we need to recognise that intercultural communication is taking place on multiple scales or levels, from the local to the national and the global, and negotiation and mediation are central to successful communication. Yeah, and we should also see communication as transcultural, where people move through and across borders and boundaries, where particular named languages and cultures are transformed and transcended. What does this mean for teaching? So teaching both through and about English requires a shift in focus. So we need to recognise that English is used as a global lingua franca for intercultural communication, and the relevance of focusing on native English speakers and Anglophone cultures becomes much less relevant, if at all relevant. We need an understanding of English as a global lingua franca as part of a multilingual repertoire rather than a monolingual standard variety. So we teach English as a multilingua franca. And we need more recognition of global Englishes and ELF as fundamentally intercultural and transcultural processes, which are not tied to any particular target culture and certainly not Anglophone cultures, and adaptation and flexibility is essential. So we teach English as part of a process of intercultural communication, which leads to new conceptions of communicative competence. Yeah, and this is what we will explore in later presentations. Okay, well, thank you very much everybody. Tosha, I hope I've said that right, and I look forward to speaking to you in the next presentation.